This is Shelby with the Rogers Public Library. So this week for Full Steam Ahead, I wanted to talk to you guys about the sun and its role in kind of sustaining life on the planet Earth. Right. So the first important thing to know is that the sun is really, really, really big. Right. So if you think about the whole solar system, which is ginormous, the overwhelming majority of mass in the solar system, so 99.86 of all the mass of all the atoms and everything in the universe are just concentrated within the sun. And because of that, because all of the mass in the universe, or almost all of the mass in the universe, is concentrated in the sun, the overwhelming majority of energy in the universe is also concentrated there. And energy is important. That's how we move stuff. So every word that I say and every movement that I do with my body uses energy. And this all comes from the sun, but it's not in a form that we can use, right? So the sun, there's a lot of chemical reactions going on there and a lot of nuclear reactions, and they release electromagnetic energy in the form of light, which is made up of tiny photons. And this travels, everywhere. It travels to the Earth, but we can't use that to power our bodies, right? We need energy in the form of chemicals, specifically things like proteins and carbohydrates and lipids. And those are the three macronutrients that we use in our diets to power our bodies. But we can't make those ourselves, right? And that's because humans are what are called heterotrophs, right? So hetero is a Latin word, or maybe Greek one. It means different, right? We have to get these chemicals from other living things. And sometimes those are plants, and sometimes they're animals or fungi. But all animals are heterotrophs, just like humans are. And where we ultimately get our energy from, what's at the bottom of the food chain, are called autotrophs. And that's plants, but it also includes things like algae and cyanobacteria. So there's kind of a distinction here where you have plants and algae on one side, and they're eukaryotes, or eukaryotic. And then on the other side, you have cyanobacteria, which is prokaryotes or prokaryotic. And what this means, it has to do with how the tiny cells that make up organisms are arranged. And plants and algae have things called organelles, or tiny organs. You can think of them kind of being like, our kidney or our heart. They do specific things in our bodies. That's what organelles do. And plants and algae have a specific type of organelle called the chloroplast. Cyanobacteria doesn't have a chloroplast. Instead, but what they do have in common is a pigment called chlorophyll, right? So this is not pure chlorophyll, because to extract pure chlorophyll from plants takes a long time. You have to use really nasty chemicals like acetone and hexane that we don't have and that we can't really store safely. But there is chlorophyll in here, right? It's what makes it green, and it's the primary pigment in plants that makes them green. So chlorophyll is kind of the root of photosynthesis, which is how plants use sunlight to make energy. This is kind of an overview of what goes on, right? So you get CO2 and water and sunlight, and plants turn that into these chemicals, sugar, which varies between plants, what's the actual sugar produced, and oxygen and water. And so the way that this happens is that photons will be absorbed by chlorophyll pigment, and that excites them, and they use the energy, and the energy from the photons is used by the plant to split apart water. And when this happens, oxygen is released, which is good. That's what all living things use to breathe with, or at least most of them, the living things that do use oxygen to breathe. And then what's left over in the plant is hydrogen. And this hydrogen has a little bit of an electrical charge in it. And because of that, it's kind of like a battery. that the plant can use to make some more complicated molecules, right? So one of them is called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. And the other one, it's got a really long name that I don't think I can pronounce, but it's abbreviated NADPH. Um, but these chemicals are kind of what power everything else in the plant, and they're what the plant uses to make carbohydrates, right? Um, so you probably know carbohydrates as sugars, right? So there's different kinds that plants make. One of them is cellulose, which is a really sturdy molecule. And this is what trees are made out of. That what makes them so tough and what makes them grow so tall. And then there's glucose, which is more the sugar that we eat, and it's used, right. And it's more short term, and it's what it's what makes things like cane sugar, or like sorghum, or things like that really sweet. Okay. So I know there's a lot of really big words here, but I want to show you guys photosynthesis in action, so that way you can get a better understanding of it. So this is a really, really easy experiment to do. The first thing that you need is just a jar like this, and you're going to dissolve a little bit of baking soda in water, and you're also going to put a drop of soap in there. So the baking soda is the source of carbon for the photosynthesis reaction, and the water is the water source. The soap does two different things, but I'll talk about those in a little bit. So what we have here is tiny little discs of spinach, right? So you do want to use something like spinach or ivy for this experiment. So I cut out 10 little discs, and I'm putting them into the syringe. Right, so that's step 1. Step 2, I'm closing the syringe. And I'm going to draw up some water into here. So, and I'm pulling back on the syringe like this. It's hard to see, but at this step, little oxygen bubbles should be escaping from the spinach discs. And what's happening is there's gases trapped between the plant cells and the spinach leaves. And as you pull it out using a vacuum, the gas escapes and it gets replaced by the baking soda dish soap solution, right? So first, the dish soap, it just helps the water get into the cells a little bit better, because the cell walls tend to be, they tend to repel water, right? And the other thing it's going to do is it's going to make it easier for the dish to sink, right? Let's see. Right, so at this point you can see a lot of the discs are sinking to the bottom. That's what we want, because it means that when we take the discs out and we put them in the jar, they're going to sink to the bottom as well. Okay. Now, so they're full of the baking soda water and they sink to the bottom. And this is a bit of a slow experiment. It will take a while to try to get the disc to rise. I can already see the oxygen bubbles forming on them, so we'll just give it a second. The cool thing about this is you can actually repeat this experiment. So let's check on this guy. Okay, so this is exact same experiment. I actually used the same water, and I waited for these to float up earlier, which took a little bit. And then I just covered them with a black piece of fabric. You can use a towel or a t-shirt or anything. And what happens is that plants don't just photosynthesize, right? When they use photosynthesis to make carbohydrates, um, they can also use those carbohydrates the way that we do, to burn them and respire, which kind of it decomposes the carbohydrates into carbon dioxide. And when this happens, um, it gives the plant more energy, but it also makes the discs heavier again, and so they will sink, and then float back up. Okay. So like I said, this is a bit of a slow experiment, especially if you're doing it inside. You can do it inside as long as you have blue light or white light, but it won't be as fast as if you do it in a window or somewhere at light. But let's talk about the craft for this week really fast. So this is also a bit of a slow craft. So there's a type of paper that you can buy called cyanotype. And it's what blueprints and stuff are made out of. And it's like a two-part dye, and you mix it together, and it makes things turn blue. But if you don't have any of this, if you don't want to go and get this fancy kit, you can also do this with construction paper, right? So I took a couple sheets of construction paper, and I stuck objects onto them. So this one had, I think, a lantern or something, and I just left them outside, and they created these really cool imprints. And so we have a square over here. This was a thermometer and a screwdriver. So this took course over the maybe 3 days or so. During the summer, it would go faster because you have more sunlight. The reason why it happens is because the UV radiation, which is high energy electromagnetic radiation from the sun, damages organic molecules like plants, or like the plant material that gets turned into paper and dies. So they lighten up, and then the stuff that's protected from UV radiation stays the same. So the whole piece of paper was this color, and then everything else brightened up. I had done some of these with leaves and stuff as well, but they didn't really make it. You need something kind of heavier that isn't going to get blown away from the wind, to stick on the paper. So let's see. Over here we have a couple discs that are floating. It seems to be going pretty slow, but over here, most of them have floated up at this point. So who knows? It might be slightly brighter over here than over here. I'm not really sure. Yeah, but that's the experiment. You can, of course, make it a little bit more scientific by doing things like trying to vary the amount of baking soda that you use, or the light sources that you use as well. But that's what I have for you guys this week. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next Thursday.